Hear the Holy Gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ, according to Matthew.
Glory to thee, O Lord.
Jesus went up the mountain and was joined by his disciples. Then he began to teach them, "You are the salt of the earth, but if salt has lost its taste, how can its saltiness be restored? It is no longer good for anything, but is thrown out and trampled underfoot. You are the light of the world. A city built on a hill cannot be hidden. No one, after lighting a lamp, puts it under the bushel basket, but on a lampstand, and it gives light to all the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father in heaven. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish, but to fulfill. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth pass away, not one letter, not one stroke of a letter will pass from the law, until all is accomplished. Therefore, whoever breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called the least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you'll never enter the kingdom of heaven." This is the gospel of the Lord.
Praise be to thee, O Christ.
So please be seated. Today I think there's a kind of common thread through the readings, which is the idea of wisdom. And it's an idea I periodically return to, because I think it's an important idea in Scripture, but it's not one that we kind of value much nowadays, and it's one that's, I think, easily misunderstood. One of the clues is that the psalm is what's called an acrostic, and that means that each line of the psalm begins with the next letter of the Hebrew alphabet, apart from the word hallelujah. So the first line begins Asher Ha'ish, happy the man. The next line is whatever it was, can't remember off the top of my head, but it begins with the letter B, and then the next line, and so on. It goes through the alphabet. And it's a kind of clue that that kind of structure indicates that the author is thinking about this genre of wisdom. And obviously that's a very kind of artificial structure for a poem. So it's a very kind of contrived thing in a way, but that doesn't mean that it's not well written. And Psalm 119, for example, is constructed in the same way. It's that massive psalm, 175 verses, and each stanza begins with the next letter, and it's incredibly well written. You hardly notice it when you're reading it. Anyway, but it gives this idea about structure and order and completeness, because the whole idea of the alphabet is that it begins from A to Z, doesn't it? You know, it's the whole thing. So it gives you the idea this is from the beginning to the end. This is everything. This is the structure of things. This is the way things are laid out. And it gives a sense of purpose and a sense of what's the word, harmony, that it's somehow complete, that one thing necessarily follows. But the way that the themes are blended together in the psalm, it begins with the name of the Lord, which is the name of the covenant, the name of the God promising us to save us, basically, to restore us, to make us well, to deliver us, all this kind of thing. And the way that God is spoken of in the Old Testament describes how the author is thinking about God's sort of role in what he's saying. Whether he's making a promise, or whether he's the creator, or whether he's the master, whether he's, all these things describe our relationship to God. So it's deeply significant which name is used. So when we say, for example, the Lord's Prayer, we say, Our Father. And that immediately defines our relationship to the one whom we're speaking to. That it's the relationship of a father and a child, and a dependent upon a provider, a protector, and that kind of thing. And so by invoking the name of the Lord in this way, it's invoking a certain kind of strand of thinking through, that it defines us and it defines who God is. But then the rest of it is about basically how people behave in society. It says about the delight in the commandments, but then it says it's good to be generous, it's good to be just, it's good to be helpful and all this kind of thing. They've given freely to the poor, all this kind of thing. And this is somehow regarded by the author as being intrinsic to their relationship to God. That if you want to know the Lord, if they want to know who the Lord is, then this is what he is like. One line which particularly caught my attention, it says, "The light shines in the darkness for the upright, the righteous and merciful and full of compassion." And this is a kind of bit of a paraphrase for how it's written. But the three words that come in the second half of that are gracious, compassionate and righteous. And the reason it really caught my attention is because the Lord is often described throughout the Old Testament as gracious and compassionate. This is who he is. This is what he's like. The Lord is gracious. The Lord has compassion. And in a series of home group things we did recently in Gilwyn, we're emphasising the Lord's heart for us, about how he is gracious and how he is compassionate. And how as much as we need compassion, the Lord has compassion for us. As much as we need grace, the Lord has grace for us. And the only way that we'll ever discover the Lord's compassion and grace is by availing ourselves of them, by receiving them. But however needy we are, we will never exhaust his compassion and his grace. Needy people are annoying, aren't they? If someone comes around you always asking for something, it gets on your nerves after a while. And after a while it kind of wears you down, it kind of makes you feel flat. You think, oh, come on, stop it, I've done all I can, I've got no more left. Whether it's money or whether it's your time, your attention, your emotions, or whatever it is. But the difference between us and God is God never runs out. He has eternity of compassion for us. Some people are annoying because they're always doing those stupid things. Sorry. And they come back the next week, sorry. And after a while you think, well, just pull yourself together, just stop doing it. It's annoying, it's irksome, But the Lord is compassionate and will always be compassionate and will always be gracious. And what this psalm is saying by drawing these things together, he's saying, not only is the Lord like that, he's saying those who would be wise would also be like that. This is, if you like, the heart of wisdom, is to be gracious and compassionate. Because that is what the Lord is like. And we're made to be like him. Now, we're made in the divine image, it says in the beginning, doesn't it? In Genesis. So we have this capacity, not just to need grace and compassion, but also to give it. And therefore we can be gracious and compassionate, like him. And one of the kind of beautiful things about this psalm is that it says this is wise. This is how the universe is made. The universe has been made in such a way that gracious and compassionate is actually wise. And it is right. It is righteous. It is good to be just. It's not just kind of pleasant or helpful to someone on the occasion. There is something substantially good about it which kind of resonates properly with the rest of creation, with the universe, if you like. The universe has what you might call a moral dimension. The created order of things has this moral dimension to it. It's not just material. If you read Ecclesiastes, it sort of talks about the vanity of everything, I saw everything under the sun, it's all pointless, it's all worthless, all this kind of stuff. And if you take it the wrong way, it's quite kind of depressing. But part of the reason for saying that is that if you're relying purely on what you can see and on what you touch, it basically doesn't make any sense. It doesn't work, it doesn't compute. So therefore you have to look beyond what you can see and what you can touch in order for things to make sense. You don't understand the meaning of your life purely in material terms. It just doesn't work. Therefore, to find out the meaning of things, you need to look beyond and part of that extra dimension to the universe, to the way things are made, is this moral dimension, which includes grace and mercy. These are moral things. These are good. Obviously, to lack them, then, is immoral. It's evil. But according to the psalm, not only would it be, if you like, immoral, it would also be foolish, because that's the opposite of wisdom. So therefore there is something inherently self-destructive about not being gracious and compassionate. And that's basically, I think, why Isaiah bangs on like he does in his reading. You know, because he's comparing the people of Israel and Judah, the house of Jacob, he says, yeah, day after day they seek me and delight to know my ways, as if they were a nation that practiced righteousness and did not forsake the ordinance of their God. So he's saying, well, they're turning up to church, they're going up, they're going through the motions as if they really meant it, but he says, you don't mean it. Why? Because you're horrible, basically. You're mean, you're tight-fisted, you're deceitful, you're horrible to each other. How can you turn to me and say that you want to know me when you're horrible to each other? You know, if you're behaving like a bunch of crooks, how on earth can I take that seriously? What do you mean by it? You turn up to church, you go through the motions, it says you bow like bulrushes in the wind, and then what? You go and rob each other. I mean, do you honestly expect me to take notice of you bowing like a bulrush in the wind if you're going to go and rob each other on the way home? I mean, you know, wake up, smell the coffee, get real. What do you think you're doing? And he says, you know, basically be honest, behave decently to one another. I know there's passages like this have been invoked in all kinds of ways in political things. But there's a measure of truth to that. There's a society that is crooked, is self-destructive. And you can see it around the world, can't you? Societies which uphold crookedness as part of the system of government basically destroy themselves. That's why, for example, Russia's falling apart, because Putin, in his infinite wisdom, instituted a system of corruption and crookedness. It's actually the mechanisms of government, would you believe it? So the whole system is completely rotten. You know, and it's crumbling, it's falling apart. Society doesn't work properly, it doesn't function. And that's the reflection of this moral dimension to creation, that for things to work well, you need this aspect of wisdom in a society, which will include basic integrity, honesty, uprightness, and mercy, and compassion, and grace. These will be part of a functional society, because this is how the universe is made. It's how we are made. And so to, if you like, defy these things, to shrug them off, is to shrug off, if you like, our very creation. It's to rebel against the way we're actually made. To use an analogy, it's like using a machine badly. If you use a machine badly, it will break. Because they're designed to be used in a certain way. And if you don't use them the right way, they'll break. And as night follows day, it's going to break down, isn't it? So if you want to use a car without crashing it, learn to drive. You know, maintain it. And if you do that, then it should serve you well. But if you don't, then you'll crash the car eventually, and the car will eventually blow up or something like that. And then you'll think, oh, why did that happen? Well, there you go. But creation itself runs in a certain way. And we're part of that. We're part of the ordering of creation. And this wisdom is part of the ordering of creation. So if we would live well, we will live according to the way we're made, according to the way the universe is made. And this includes compassion and grace and mercy. And all these qualities which are not particularly highly valued now. How many people do you know that are widely respected and esteemed for being kind? And you hear someone trumpeting, wow, so-and-so is really kind. They're awesome, they're kind. I mean, do you actually hear that kind of thing very often? And yet when you meet someone that really is kind, it's actually really nice. You know, it's really pleasant, isn't it, to deal with someone that is kind. But it is not something that wins widespread admiration. And yet that is how we're made. That is wisdom. There's actually wisdom in kindness. It's not just a superficial thing. It's actually quite a profound thing. If you like, it's not the jam on the bread. That is the bread. And yet, this idea of this principle of wisdom, which which I think is part of creation, is the thing which Paul is talking about, but in his usual kind of brilliant, dazzling, witty way. Because he compares the wisdom of the world with the wisdom which is from God. And he speaks of this wisdom which is from heaven, which ultimately is salvation, which ultimately is Christ, in his grace, his mercy, his compassion, dying for us. That is heavenly wisdom. And that is something inexplicable to the mechanisms of the world. It's completely opaque, cannot be understood. And yet that is the profound wisdom of God and heaven and creation. And Paul compares this with what he calls the wisdom of the world, which is about slick presentation, which is about cleverness, which is about manipulation, about show, which is about manipulating people, about tricking them, about all the things which people do to get ahead in life and to show off. All the things which actually in the short term work, basically. Now, there's that famous heading as to how to get ahead in advertising. Well, it's not by being truthful, is it? But that's the wisdom of the world, and that ultimately burns itself. And so part of this heavenly wisdom is to accept that maybe we will not be quite as glamorous or as successful or as admired as some other people around in the world, but we will be complete. We will be, if you like, wholesome. And that idea of completeness, Christ came, he says, to fulfill the law, to make it complete. Somehow he embodies it in his very nature. Somehow he actually, by living his life, somehow made it full. And the course of his life somehow embodied that wisdom and the law of God, the revelation of God. And somehow he brings that fulfillment to us. But when he says, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees, he's talking about something which he can confer upon us, which somehow is this wisdom which Paul speaks of, but by which if we will inhabit, we will be like him. We will display that grace and that compassion and that mercy, because we will have been delivered from the deceits and the allures of the things around us, which will take us away from our creation, take us away from the knowledge of God, which will take us away from wisdom. And so I would encourage us all to look for these spiritual wisdom which Paul speaks of. For we can have the mind of Christ, as he says. We can think about these things. We can understand them if we will only but ask. And I think we need to have confidence in the value of these things, because it's easy to lose confidence in them and to shrink from doing them. And yet, if we can do that in that assurance of Christ that is blessing upon us, conferring that righteousness on us, conferring his approval on us, then we'll have confidence to do what is right in his eyes, confidence to be a sweet smell in the world, confidence to live according to his ways, which is good. Amen. Thank you.